So I'm going to start on VI1s, and this presentation is significantly different to how it was written 2 days ago, because we fortunately had some news back from government that they would be suspended for EU imports to the UK. But before I go into that, I thought I'd go through actually what VI1s are and why, and give you some kind of context behind VI1 documentation so that you understand why it's such a good thing that it's been suspended for EU imports to the UK. And then I'll also go on to why it's still relevant and why you still need to know what they are and why you should be aware of them once the UK leaves the EU. Oh, sorry, go back to that slide. So what is a VI1? So a VI1 is a document which accompanies wine imports and exports. It's something which is made from, was produced by the EU to kind of track movements of goods and make sure they're compliant with the single market rules for wine, and so they need to be compliant with the OIV. This essentially means that the form will include analysis of the wine itself, which I'll come on to in a second. I suppose the important thing to know about it is that it is a paper form. And so it needs to actually accompany the document when it's in movement, which is probably something Duncan might be aware of with some of his transporters. There's also another thing called a VI2, which is essentially the same as a VI1. It includes all of the same information, but it's just for split consignments, but it's just something to be aware of. So currently, the EU requires a VI1 form for wine imports, unless if there's a preferential agreement. So I'll come on to it in a second, but there are some countries where they can use a simplified VI1 form. Currently, while we're in the EU, you don't need a VI1 form, obviously, between EU countries, because everybody's bound by the same rules and regulations anyway for wine. But because of the Withdrawal Act, the EU's VI1 legislation has been rolled over into the UK as is. However, there are some caveats to that, and there are some changes that you should be aware of, which actually make things a lot simpler. So this is a much less doom and gloom presentation than it would have been 2 days ago. So this is kind of what a VI1 looks like. This is an example of the UK VI1. Essentially, it's pretty much identical to the EU VI1, apart from the fact that it literally just says United Kingdom in a couple of boxes. The information that's required is, first of all, you need a stamp from a competent authority. So in this kind of orange box here, the competent authority for the UK will be DEFRA. In the EU, there's a list of competent authorities for third countries. And they are allowed to sign off the form. So, for example, if you're importing a wine from Australia, for example, it will be signed off by the Australian wine body. You also need to include the quantity, which is something I'll again come on to later, because that's still quite important. And then you also need to include an analysis report, which is probably the most bureaucratic and overly complicated thing that you would ever need in wine, and probably not many people actually need to know. And that includes things like the density of the grape must and grape juice, total alcoholic strength and actual alcoholic strength, fine. And then you also have total dry extract, and then about 3 types of acidity, and the total amount of sulfur dioxide. We reckon that, from asking around in some third countries, that it costs around £330 to produce a VI1 form, and you would need it for pretty much every different batch of wine that you would be bringing in. So there are some exemptions, which I spoke about a minute ago. Probably doesn't apply to many people, but if, for example, you're trading in fine wine and you have a very, very small consignment, anything in less than 100 litres, in separate consignments can move quite freely without a VI1, that's fine. Things like for personal use, personal property, and if you're doing kind of trade fairs or anything like that, that's fine. There's also 2 which I've kind of underlined at the bottom though, which are quite important, which I'll come on to again in a second, which are if the wine is originated and bottled in the EU, you re-export it out of the EU and send it back to the EU, you don't need to have a VI1 form for it to be sent back. And likewise, because we've rolled over that legislation for the UK, if it's originated, bottled in the UK, for example, in English sparkling wine, sent to the EU and then brought back to the UK, you also wouldn't need to bring a VI1 with that. Saying that, So the other day we found out that the government has now finally tabled, after about 2 years of nagging, a statutory instrument, which is secondary legislation, which says that the UK won't require VI1 forms from the EU to the UK for a temporary period of 9 months. Those 9 months we would like to use to simplify the form that we'll need for wine imports, and that's not just for wine from the EU. We'd like to make sure that the form is simplified for everywhere. We think there's information there which isn't necessarily needed, and we would also like to try and use those 9 months to make it electronic. Considering the fact that we've spent 2 years asking for a relatively simple halt on VI1s from the EU, we think we probably might need longer than 9 months, but it's a start. We won't need them from day one, no deal. But as I said, it doesn't make them obsolete. They will actually play a part, and you'll probably see more of them after a no-deal Brexit in other situations. So, a nice easy one. This was way more complicated before. I'm really happy about this slide. So as I said, there'll be a 9-month exemption for period for EU wine coming into the UK. However, and this is kind of going back to this slide, with this section here and a little bit from here, you will need to provide some information which is additional on top of what you would normally be sending. And DEFRA have said that will be the evidence of the alcohol content and the volume of wine in the consignment. My previous conversations with DEFRA is that that can be included on an EAD document. How that will work in practice, we need to kind of work out with them, and we'll be sending further information out when it arises. However, as I said a minute ago, this could change in 9 months. Ideally, we would like to be in a situation where we're not moving to a full VI1 form, and we're changing to a simplified form, so that there's only one change for businesses. But again, I think we kind of need to keep the pressure up, and that's a WSTA job to do, with some backing from you all, of course. Here's where the change comes in for a lot of people. If you're producing wine in the UK, if you're sending wine to the EU, it will need to be accompanied by a full EU VI1. So you'll need to do all the lab testing, you'll have to complete the form, you'll have to send it along with your consignment to the EU. DEFRA will be the competent authority for that. They'll be issuing the VI1s, and we would recommend, if you do produce wine in the UK, I don't know how many producers there actually are here today, but you need to register ASAP with the FSA or the FSS if you're in Scotland, so that you can get a WSB number from them, which you can then give to DEFRA to get your form. You may already have one. You might have already been issued a WSB number, so have a look out for that letter. If not, get in touch with DEFRA, and the FSS or the FSA, and they will sort that out for you. On laboratories, we don't actually have any information on which laboratories will be the registered ones in the UK. I've got an idea of who they might be. I don't think I'm actually allowed to say who they are, but we'll hopefully be sending out some information, ideally in the next 2 weeks before we actually leave the EU. So what happens to kind of other movements? If you're bringing EU wine into the UK in bottle and then send it back to the EU, it has an exemption, so it can be returned to the EU without VO1. So for example, if you are a fine wine trader, you can send your EU wine back to the EU, no problem, and that will be fine. If you import EU wine in bulk, which some people do, bottle it in the UK and then send it back out to the EU, it will need to be accompanied by either an EU VI1 when it's returned, which needs to be an original one that it comes with, but if it's in that 9-month transition period, you're probably going to have to produce a VI1 yourself in the UK for that wine to send it back. Also, I've kind of got a little note on the bottom which isn't necessarily related to VI1s, but you should probably be looking at IPR in that kind of scenario when you're moving wine post-Brexit. On to third countries. This won't change particularly. This is exactly as how it happens now. So third country wine entering the UK, other than wine from the EU at the moment, will still need to be accompanied by a VI1 form. So there's no change there. There are third countries which have simplified procedures, so Australia, the US and Chile all have either a simplified form, or for the US I think it's a simplified document. However, post-Brexit day one no deal, you will have to, the goods will have to be accompanied by a UK VI1 form. This isn't necessarily, there is, however, a 9-month transition period again, so if you have a wine from Australia sent to the UK with an EU VI1 form, it won't be rejected. The UK will accept it because the forms are basically identical, and it'll be the same competent authorities in the third countries. After that 9-month period, you should be making your suppliers aware that they will need to provide a UK VI1 form if it's coming into the UK. So if you import third country wine to the UK, and then send it back out to the EU, they will still need to be accompanied by a VI1. It's slightly different for if you're importing in bottle or if you are bottling it in the UK. So if it's, usually it can be sent on to the EU with the original VI1 form. It'll just need a covering VI1. So for example, if you import a wine from Australia on a UK VI1 form, you can cover it with a EU VI1, which will be issued by DEFRA in the UK, send your wine on with the same information as is on that original VI1 form, so you won't need to retest your wine. There are, however, if you're bottling in the UK, potentially some issues if you are processing the wine or changing the wine in any way. However, we think there's some leeway in that if you're just using permitted EU processes to process your wine, you shouldn't have to produce a new form if you're sending it onto the EU. So that shouldn't be an issue. Again, if you're doing this, have a look at IPR. You might want to use it. So I think that was all my slides, but if anybody has any questions on that, obviously ask me in a second. I've done a really quick slide on labelling because I think this would probably be more open to questions later if anybody has any questions. I know we've sent out a lot of information to our members and government's put out a lot of information as well. However, if you have any questions other than this, let me know. But it is relatively simple. So in the UK, the government's agreed to a 21-month transition period for labels on the UK market in the event of a no-deal exit. So that means if you're importing wine into the UK, it can stay the same as it currently is. Day one, no deal, doesn't need to change on the label for 21 months. After that 21-month period, you will have to have a importer address for the UK, or if it's bottled in the UK, you'll have to have a UK bottler address. So that there's somebody which is kind of a responsible body which is responsible for the wine so that a consumer can get back to them to say, this isn't right. In the EU, day one no deal, it's slightly different. If we leave on the 31st of October, on the 1st of November, you will need to change your labels on the back of the product or relabel. So they will have to comply with EU labelling regulations. So if it's an EU wine, for example, it can have a bottler, producer or vendor from the EU on the label, and that's fine. If it's a non-EU wine, it will have to have an EU importer address on the label. This needs to be an actual address. You can't necessarily have a PO box. It needs to be something that somebody can actually physically contact. David can probably give you a little bit more information about, potentially, he might be able to give you a little bit more information about that later. If not, I will send some further information out about that. If you're placing goods on the EU market, though, on the 31st of October, you can continue to sell those goods until exhaustion. And the UK government's put out quite a good piece of guidance. If you've not seen it, I can circulate it on the definition of placing on the market before and after the UK leaves the EU if there's a no Brexit deal. Essentially, it says that placing a product on the market supposes there's an offer or agreement, written or verbal, for the transfer of ownership, possession, or any kind of right, excluding intellectual property rights, concerning the product in question after the manufacturing stage has taken place. It does not require physical delivery of the product. I'd like to caveat this that this is the UK version of this guidance and this is the UK advice. The EU does have advice on placing on the market, but it doesn't go into so much depth. I would have a look at this document though, because it does have some really good examples. The only issue is it doesn't include anything on EU side of what placing on the market means. So I think from a business perspective, that's something that's a risk for you to weigh up.